On July the 10th, 1553, a young woman was declared Queen of England, England's first queen regnant. Her name was Lady Jane Grey, and just 9 days later, she was a prisoner in the Tower. What happened in those 9 days was more than a failed coup. It was a last-ditch attempt by Edward VI government to preserve Protestant power, and it collapsed with breathtaking speed. But what's even more remarkable is who took the throne instead. Mary Tudor, a woman the political establishment had written off as outdated, dangerously Catholic, and politically irrelevant. And yet Mary won, without an army, without a formal base of power, just with her name, her father's legacy, and the backing of a population that, frankly, wasn't interested in watching another political gamble tear the country apart. This episode isn't just about Jane, though her story is central. It's about how the machinery behind her brief reign came apart almost immediately. It's about Northumberland's miscalculations, the power of legitimacy, and how Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, turned a quiet escape into a triumphant march to the throne. The 9 days that Jane was queen tell us a lot about Tudor politics, who actually held power, how fast public opinion could turn, and what happened when you try to force a dynasty into a direction it didn't want to go. Hey friend, welcome back to the Renaissance English History Podcast. I am your host, Heather, and I am, as always, delighted that you are here with me. This week we are talking about Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen, and not just about Jane, but about the failed coup and about how Mary Tudor was able to overcome the threats against her and to claim the throne without any bloodshed. So let's get right into it. By early 1553, it was clear that Edward VI was dying. He was only 15, but the effects of tuberculosis, or what his contemporaries called consumption, were impossible to ignore. His coughing fits worsened, his weight dropped, and his council began to panic. Edward, despite his youth, was deeply committed to Protestant reform. He'd been raised under the influence of Archbishop Cranmer, and he took his role as a godly prince seriously. The idea that his crown might pass to Mary Tudor, his Catholic half-sister, horrified him. And that is where the device for the succession comes in. Edward began drafting the document himself in early 1553. Now, originally it stated that the crown would pass to the heirs male of Lady Jane Grey, but when it became clear that Edward didn't have enough time to wait for Jane to produce an heir, the wording was revised to name Jane herself as the heir outright. Now, who exactly was Lady Jane Grey? Lady Jane Grey was the daughter of Frances Grey, the Duchess of Suffolk. She was in turn the daughter of Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's younger sister, the Queen of France, for a short time, who was married to Charles Brandon. So Lady Jane Grey herself would have been like a great niece to Henry VIII. The problem with this arrangement was that it ignored both Mary and Elizabeth, Henry's daughters, who each had been restored to the line of succession in their father's will. Yes, both had technically been declared illegitimate during their father's lifetime, but Henry's final act had reinstated them. Edward, by naming Jane, was overriding his father's settlement and an act of Parliament. It was a bold move, and he wasn't working alone. John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, had recently married his son Guilford Dudley to Jane. The timing was, of course, not a coincidence. With Edward's failing health, Dudley was positioning his family as the power behind the next monarch. Jane was educated, pious, and Protestant. But more importantly, she had no power base of her own, so she was controllable. Jane herself doesn't seem to have been consulted. Later reports suggest that when she learned of the plan, she collapsed in tears or fainted. She insisted that she never sought the crown. But, and this is key, she also accepted it, whether through pressure, duty, or fear is hard to say. The Privy Council, likely under heavy pressure from Dudley and perhaps genuinely afraid of a Catholic queen, signed off on the plan. Even Cranmer, who had been close to Henry and knew better than anyone the legal problems with bypassing Mary, eventually added his own signature. On paper, it looked neat. The Protestant rule was preserved, the Dudley family was secured, and a calm handover of power was planned. But outside the court bubble, very few people even knew who Lady Jane Grey was. She had no public support, no military backing of her own, and no real claim that people recognized. It was a succession engineered entirely from the top down, and it was about to come apart almost as quickly as it was declared. So on July the 10th, 1553, Lady Jane Grey was officially proclaimed the Queen of England. She was escorted by barge to the Tower of London, the traditional residence, of course, of monarchs before they were crowned, and she took up residence as queen. That same day, the Privy Council issued formal orders. Jane's name was entered into the official records. Bishops were told to preach in her name. Coins were minted. Prayers were rewritten. But outside the walls of the Tower, the mood was... In London, people heard the proclamation and responded with the dead silence. There were no celebrations in the streets, no church bells, no bonfires. Even those who supported the Protestant cause weren't even quite sure what to make of this obscure teenage girl being named queen over both Henry VIII's daughters. It also didn't help that Mary Tudor had already made her first move. Just a few days earlier, as Edward lay dying, Mary had been tipped off about the plan to block the succession. She rode hard for East Anglia, heading straight to the place where she knew she had allies, Framlingham Castle. Meanwhile, back in London, the new regime was already showing some cracks. One of Jane's first acts was to refuse the demand that her husband, Guildford, was to be declared king. Now, this infuriated the Dudley family, especially her mother-in-law, the Duchess of Northumberland, who apparently shouted at Jane in front of the court. Jane held her ground, insisting that Guildford would be a duke, not a king. That single moment exposed the entire house of cards. It was immediately clear that Jane wasn't as pliable as Dudley had hoped. Her refusal to elevate Guildford undermined the idea that the Dudleys could rule through her, and it began to drive a wedge between the new queen and the faction that had installed her. Meanwhile, the Privy Council was a little bit uneasy. Their signatures were on the device, yes, but many of them had long-standing ties to Mary. Some had even served with her mother, Catherine of Aragon, decades before. Others had personal reservations about the legality of Jane's claim. And most of all, they were watching how the country reacted, which was a big nothing burger. No outpouring of support, no groundswell of loyalty, just a deep and uneasy silence. Northumberland, who had been the architect of the whole succession plan, now had to scramble to build support for Jane on the ground. But his influence was waning. The further from London he went, the more Mary's name and her legitimacy carried weight. Jane, for her part, continued to carry herself as a queen with dignity. She spent time in prayer. She attended to state matters with seriousness. She thought that perhaps God had actually put her in this position, so she was going to accept it and do the best she could. And she followed through on the daily business of queenship and getting ready to be crowned. But she had no experience, no allies outside of her husband's faction, and no real power. She had the title, but Mary had the loyalty of the people, and things were about to turn very quickly in Mary's favor. So while Jane was being moved into the Tower and proclaimed queen with all of the outward trappings of monarchy, Mary Tudor was already in motion. On July 9th, 1553, before Jane had even been publicly proclaimed, Mary received word that Edward had died and that her enemies planned to cut her out of the succession. She didn't wait to see if the council would honor her claim. She rode hard for East Anglia, like I said, the region where she held her estates, her long-standing supporters, and something far more valuable, her power base. She arrived at Framlingham Castle, a strong fortress in Suffolk that had been part of the Howard family holdings, and there Mary made her stand. And this is where it gets interesting, because Mary didn't have an army, at least not yet. She had a name, and in 1553, that was more powerful than anyone had predicted. Mary didn't send out fiery manifestos or call for rebellion. She issued carefully crafted proclamations emphasizing her legitimacy. She was Henry VIII's daughter. She was born in wedlock. She was named in his will, and she was confirmed by statute as the next in line after Edward. Whatever people thought about her religion, and there were concerns about her Catholicism, she was, by all reasonable standards, the rightful heir. and people responded. Nobles and gentry began to flock to her, many of whom had nothing to gain from supporting Jane. In fact, many of them had quietly stayed out of politics completely during Edward's reign, watching the religious changes with growing discomfort. Mary, to them, represented not just legitimacy, but also a return to order, a queen whose claim was rooted in law and blood, not paperwork drafted by a dying boy in a power-hungry council. She also had the support of ordinary people. In East Anglia, a region still thick with traditional Catholic sentiment, crowds gathered to cheer her on. Towns raised men to serve her, and by mid-July, Mary, who had fled without a military escort, now had a growing armed force behind her. The Privy Council in London began to sweat. John Dudley, realizing the threat, persuaded the council to let him march out to confront her. He set out with a small force, expecting to rally more support as he moved north, except that support did not materialize. Worse, his own troops began to desert, some slipping away to join Mary's forces, others simply melting back into the countryside. No one wanted to fight a popular royal woman who was, by most standards, the rightful heir, especially not in defense of a girl that no one had chosen. Mary, from her position at Framlingham, now ordered issues like a queen. She appointed commanders, she raised troops, she sent letters, all while Jane sat in the tower waiting for a coronation ceremony that was never going to come. What started as a defensive retreat had turned into a full-fledged counterclaim. And back in London, things were falling apart. So I just want to pause for a moment, too, and say that over on my YouTube channel a couple of weeks ago, I put up a poll and asked you all what you thought, whether Jane should be called Jane the First, since she was kind of the queen, or whether no, because she was never crowned, she never ruled properly. I did make the point that, of course, Edward V was never crowned because he was in the Tower held by Richard III, and yet we still consider him Edward III. So the whole having a coronation ceremony doesn't mean so much to me, but I wondered what you all thought. Should she be called Jane I, or no, because she never ruled properly? And 668 of you voted in that poll, and it's really split down the middle. Yes, she should be called Jane I, won with 56% of the vote, and no, not crowned, never ruled properly, came in second, of course, because there were only two choices. So that took 44% of the vote. So according to those of you who voted on YouTube, she should be called Jane I for whatever that's worth. I just think that's a fun little thing to think about. What do you think? Should she have been called Jane I? Should we refer to her now as Jane I? I'd love to know what you think about that. Speaking of interjections, if you're listening to this and thinking, why don't I have more people in my life to talk about Lady Jane Grey's coup and Northumberland's spectacular miscalculation? Well, I have some good news. You can come to TudorCon in October. We still have a handful of spaces left in person. 3 days of talks, music, food, and serious Tudor nerdery and friendships held at a real Tudor manor house, Agecroft Hall, that was brought from Lancashire. It's in Richmond, Virginia, and you can get tickets at englandcast.com/TudorCon. They're still at the early bird rate until the end of the month. After that, I'm going to put them up to the regular rate, which I think is $50 more. If you can't travel, you can join TudorCon from home with full online access plus some extra streaming talks just that are for the online people. We'll be streaming the whole weekend right to your sofa or hammock. You can stay in your pajamas, no judgment at all. And that is at englandcast.com/TudorCon from home. And if you enter the code EARLYBIRD right now, you can save $15 off that. So englandcast.com/TudorCon to come in person, englandcast.com/TudorCon from home to come from your jammies. You are invited. We would love to see you October 3rd through 5th. Don't miss it. So by mid-July, the political gamble that had placed Lady Jane Grey on the throne was in free fall. John Dudley had left London on July 14th to march north and confront Mary's growing forces in East Anglia. He had only a small army, somewhere around 3,000 men, and no real enthusiasm behind him. His march was slow, and it was plagued by desertions and hesitation. Towns that should have welcomed him offered zero support. Some actually quietly closed their gates. Others made it clear that their loyalties were leaning toward Mary. And Dudley knew exactly what was happening. According to one report, he turned to a companion and said bitterly, "The people press to see us, but not one says God speed us." Meanwhile, back in London, the Privy Council was losing its nerve. At first, they'd followed Dudley's lead, issuing Jane's proclamations, swearing oaths, going through all the motions. But as the news from East Anglia trickled in, and as Mary's support kept growing, they started looking for their exit plan. Some of the councillors were secretly corresponding with Mary already, hedging their bets. Others, including the Earl of Arundel, began openly pressing for the council to reverse course. Jane's father, Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, had been left behind in London, effectively acting as her political regent. But he had no control over the council and no real military authority. He was also indecisive and prone to panicking, not exactly a strong figure to rally around. The real turning point came on July the 19th. That morning, the Privy Council, which had been meeting at Baynard's Castle, quietly left the city and regrouped at the house of the Earl of Pembroke. There they drafted and signed a formal proclamation declaring Mary Tudor the rightful Queen of England. The news spread instantly, of course. Bonfires were lit, bells rang across London. Crowds flooded the streets to celebrate, some out of relief, others out of genuine joy. Even many Protestants who were wary of Mary's Catholicism were just glad the whole thing was over. And Jane? Well, she was still in the Tower when the announcement reached her, not as queen now, but as a prisoner. The same royal fortress that had welcomed her as a monarch 9 days earlier had now become her jail cell. Later that day, Northumberland, still in Cambridge and now fully aware that he had been abandoned, publicly declared for Mary. He threw his cap in the air, swore allegiance, and tried to save himself, like that was going to really work. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. He was arrested within 24 hours and taken back to London, and he would be executed a few weeks later on August the 22nd. In the Tower, Jane was formally deposed. Her name was removed from official documents. The crown she had worn briefly, a smaller version of the state crown made for the coronation, was taken away. Her husband, Guilford, was also imprisoned, and so were her parents, though her mother, Frances, would later be released. It was all over. The coup hadn't just failed, it had completely disintegrated. And it had done so not because Mary had more soldiers or better strategy or stronger propaganda or anything like that. It had failed because the heart of Tudor power, the nobility, the legal system, and the public just didn't accept Jane's claim. She was smart, educated, devout, and serious, but she had no real support. Mary, on the other hand, had the thing that mattered most in Tudor England, a father named Henry VIII. Looking back at those 9 days, it's tempting to see Lady Jane Grey as a tragic figure caught in the middle of someone else's power play, and she was that. But the failure of her reign wasn't just bad luck. It was the result of serious miscalculations at every level: political, legal, and personal. First and foremost, legitimacy still mattered in Tudor England. Edward VI's device for the succession was clever, but it wasn't enough. It was never ratified by Parliament. It contradicted both Henry's will and an act of succession passed during Henry's lifetime. By the letter of the law, Mary was the rightful heir. And that carried enormous weight with people, even those who might have preferred a Protestant monarch. Mary was Henry's daughter. Everyone remembered her mother, Catherine of Aragon, who had been queen for over 20 years. Whatever doubts existed about her religion, her bloodline was beyond dispute. The second problem was the Dudley name. Jane may have been intelligent and pious, but she was deeply tied to the most hated man in England at the time. John Dudley had risen quickly under Edward VI, sidelining rivals and dominating the court. Many in the nobility distrusted him. Some outright hated him. Installing his daughter-in-law on the throne looked like a power grab, not a legitimate succession. Even those who supported Jane's religion recoiled at the idea of Dudley effectively ruling through her. Then there was public perception. Jane was barely known outside of court circles. She hadn't spent time building a public persona or visiting the provinces. Mary, on the other hand, had lived quietly but was still a known quantity. She had a network of household servants, nobles, former allies from her mother's faction, and they all remembered her. There were also some critical strategic blunders. Northumberland underestimated just how quickly Mary could rally support. He overestimated how loyal his troops would be. And most fatally, he left London, effectively giving the Privy Council room to reverse course without having to face him directly. And finally, Jane's own position was deeply compromised from the start. Her refusal to name her husband Guilford king angered the faction that had put her on the throne. She wasn't in control, and everybody knew that. The fact that she had to fight her in-laws before even being crowned made it clear to the council that this was not a unified regime. In the end, Jane never had a foundation to stand on. The political scaffolding around her collapsed almost immediately because it was brittle, self-serving, and completely disconnected from what the country actually wanted. Mary, for all her faults, understood power better, and she had one thing her opponents couldn't manufacture: a claim that people actually believed. So after the Privy Council declared for Mary, Jane's fate changed instantly. She was no longer the queen, she was a traitor. She was still only 16, she had reigned for just 9 days, and now she was a prisoner. At first, Mary, of course, showed surprising restraint. Jane was young, intelligent, clearly a pawn in someone else's game. Mary ordered that she be held but not mistreated. She was given a decent apartment. She was allowed books, even had occasional visitors. There's no evidence that Mary initially intended to execute her. John Dudley, of course, had no such leniency. Like we said, he was executed a month after he was arrested on August 22nd, just over a month after Jane had been proclaimed queen. He died insisting that he had only followed the king's will, a claim that nobody was really moved by. Jane's own father, Henry Grey, was also released. Despite being deeply involved in the coup, he was forgiven, likely because Mary wanted to avoid creating too many martyrs. It was a generous act, and as it turned out, it was a mistake. In January 1554, just 6 months into Mary's reign, Jane's father joined Wyatt's rebellion, an uprising sparked by outrage over Mary's plans to marry Philip of Spain. The rebellion, of course, failed, but the implications were clear. Jane's family was still dangerous, and Mary could no longer afford to be merciful. Jane and Guilford were both sentenced to death, and on the morning of February 12, 1554, Guilford was executed first. Jane actually watched his body return to the Tower from her window. A short time later, she herself was taken to the scaffold on Tower Green. Her final words were quiet, steeped in religious conviction. She declared herself a faithful Christian, asked for forgiveness, and forgave her executioners. Her body was buried near that of Anne Boleyn in the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, another young woman executed at the command of a Tudor monarch. In the centuries that followed, Jane's reputation was reshaped. Protestant writers in Elizabeth's reign turned her into a martyr. She was included in Fox's Book of Martyrs as a symbol of purity and reform crushed by Catholic tyranny. That image stuck in literature, portraiture, and eventually in pop culture. But the real Jane was much more complicated. She was clever, she was principled, and she was politically aware, but deeply vulnerable to the ambitions of those around her. She didn't start the coup, she didn't want the crown, but when offered it, she also didn't refuse. And that choice, made under pressure in a world she couldn't control, would cost her everything. And so Lady Jane's 9 days on the throne are often reduced to a tragic blip, a teenage girl used and discarded by men chasing power. And while there is indeed some truth in that, the story is more than just pathos. Jane's reign failed because the people who installed her underestimated Mary, misunderstood the meaning of legitimacy, and overestimated how far fear and control could go without true support. Mary, who had no army, no position, no official title, took back the throne through sheer determination, lineage, and the fact that enough people still believed in her right to rule. Jane didn't fail because she was weak or foolish. She failed because the entire framework around her was built on sand. And yet she remains one of the most memorable figures of the Tudor period. Not because of what she herself did, but because of what she represented, a regime that tried to rewrite the rules of succession overnight, and a teenage girl caught in the middle when it all collapsed. So, my friend, do you have thoughts on Jane or on Mary? Drop me a comment wherever you're listening to this or a message. You can also join the Tudor Learning Circle, a social network just for Tudor history nerds, at tudorlearningscircle.com. And of course, don't forget you can check out TudorCon if you want to talk about it in person with fellow Tudor history nerds. I will see you there. All right, I will speak with you soon. Have an amazing week. Thanks for being here. Bye-bye.